The menace of the German U-boats in the Atlantic must also be finally overcome. This was essential for the security of the supply lines between North America and Europe. Also, the Anglo-American bomber forces in Britain were to launch a sustained air offensive on Germany in order to disrupt industry, lower morale, and wear down the Luftwaffe. Sicily was invaded in July 1943. By now, the Western Allies had decided that Italy should be knocked out of the war, and as many German divisions tied down there as possible. Accordingly, Anglo-American forces invaded the Italian mainland in September 1943. While the German troops there resisted fiercely, the Italian government quickly made peace. Now began a long and grueling Allied advance up the Italian peninsula. But while British and American attention was focused on the Mediterranean, preparation for the cross-channel invasion had already begun. In April 1943, the British General Frederick Morgan was appointed Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander Designate, or Cossack for short. Cossack was to gather the maximum possible forces in Britain and draw up a number of plans. The most important was a cross-channel invasion of France as early as possible in 1944 under the codename Overlord. Cossack's first problem was where to land on the French coast. The prime consideration was that it must be within range of England-based fighters. This reduced the options to the area within the arc shown on the map. Throughout the past 3 years, aircraft had been overflying the coastline, taking photographs of the defences. Other information had been gathered from people's pre-war holiday postcards and photographs. Beaches had been analysed, and special forces had and were continuing to test the defences through raids. There was also information flowing from the French resistance. Cossack deduced that there were only 2 feasible areas for landing a large force. The first was the Pas-de-Calais, where the channel was at its narrowest, but it was, in German eyes, the most likely point of attack. He therefore opted for Normandy, where the coastline was less heavily defended. He calculated that there would be sufficient shipping for 3 divisions to make the initial landings. To convince the Germans that the Pas-de-Calais was the target, an elaborate deception plan was drawn up. To prevent them reinforcing France from other theatres, false plans included landings in Norway, Brittany, and the Balkans. Much technical ingenuity was employed. Artificial harbours called mulberries were designed and built. Towed across the channel, they would ensure the supply and reinforcement of the troops ashore until a major port, in this case Cherbourg, could be opened. To keep the forces ashore supplied with the vast amounts of fuel that warfare by then required, a pipeline was to be laid across the channel. Pluto, or pipeline under the ocean. Pluto's pumping stations were disguised as beach cafes and ice cream parlours. It was vital that tanks be landed with the first waves ashore. Those used at Dieppe in August 1942 had, with few exceptions, been unable to get off the beach. The British therefore began to develop what was called specialised armour, more popularly known as the funnies. As well as swimming tanks, these included flamethrower vehicles to help overcome strongpoints. There were flail tanks for clearing lanes through minefields. Bridge layer tanks enabled the armour to get across anti-tank ditches. There was another factor: the English Channel itself. Much meteorological research had to be done to establish the best time to cross and carry out landings on this piece of sea which had a reputation for being unruly. It was at Quebec, capital of French-speaking Canada, that another Allied strategic conference was held in August 1943. This approved Cossack's plans, but as yet no commanders for Overlord had been appointed. At least, though, the highly complex preparations for the invasion could now get properly underway. On the other side of the Channel, Hitler had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a system of concrete gun emplacements and strongpoints all along the French coast. But once Hitler had decided to commit his main war effort to attacking Russia, the defense of Western Europe became a much lower priority. It was largely garrisoned by low-grade troops. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who assumed as Commander-in-Chief West in early 1942, increasingly complained of this, especially in the light of the build-up of Allied forces in Britain. It was not, however, until November 1943 that Hitler finally woke up to the looming danger in the West. He ordered a strengthening of the forces deployed there and sent Erwin Rommel, who had been such a thorn in the flesh of the British forces in North Africa, on a tour of inspection. He then appointed Rommel to command the defences of northern France. Rommel believed that the invasion must be defeated on the beaches and set about strengthening the coast defences. These included the erection of obstacles on all possible landing beaches. Rommel also wanted to keep the panzer divisions close to the coast, but their commander wanted to keep them concentrated to strike at the Allies once they were ashore. Hitler stepped in, and eventually a compromise was reached. Rommel would be allowed a third of the tanks. A third would remain in southern France, and the remainder held as a central reserve, but not to be moved without Hitler's permission. By autumn 1943, preparation for Overlord was well underway. But the Allies had still not appointed a commander. They had merely agreed that he should be an American because of their larger forces. Not until December was Eisenhower, who was the Allied commander in the Mediterranean, appointed as supreme commander.